The work that I'm going to be describing is work that has been done jointly with WCS for about 10 years now. So I started going to northeastern Madagascar in 2004, and it was really targeted at understanding bushmeat consumption. And at that time, I was very much focused on this as a singular biodiversity conservation issue. And as time unfolded there, I really began to see that this was an issue that really fell at the intersection of human well-being, human health, human livelihoods, and also biodiversity conservation. And so I'll talk to you about some of the frameworks, the ecosystem service frameworks, and also some of the economic frameworks of how we've come to understand this issue and how we're attempting to solve it in terms of interventions. The program that I work with specifically at WCS is called HEAL. It stands for Health and Ecosystems Analysis of Linkages. It's a 25-institution consortium comprised of academic, NGO, and government-level partners. And the overall mission is to understand, through empirical, evidence-based research, the connections between environmental change and human health. And so this project in Madagascar is one of the different dimensions that focuses on nutrition. We do have other projects that focus on non-communicable disease, infectious disease, and mental health as well. At a global level, this issue of bushmeat and economies is really a trade that's valued at billions of dollars per year. And I want to just take a moment to make a distinction between the urban luxury aspects of the trade and the local safety net subsistence aspects of bushmeat harvesting and hunting, because they present very different contextual situations for wildlife harvesting and also very different ethical dimensions to bushmeat harvesting. The case that we're largely dealing with in Madagascar is actually almost entirely on the right, where this is a largely subsistence network of hunting, where all of the sales are happening on household-to-household local transactions, and there's a near absence of any type of urban or luxury markets for these types of meats. Preliminary work that we've done, and this is in a cross-regional analysis across Africa, looked at data from Madagascar, Cameroon, Kenya, and Ghana. And when we combined all of those data together at the household scale, we saw that there was almost no pattern, so that's in box A right there, between a household's wealth and their amount of bushmeat consumption. And then if we look in the most rural areas, we can see that as wealth increases, there's actually a very strong connection between wealth and bushmeat harvesting, where as your wealth increases, your reliance on this type of wildlife actually sharply declines. And in the 25% most urban areas, you can see that as wealth increases, bushmeat consumption increases and then plateaus. And so this really provides this economic framework where in rural areas that are more likely to be a subsistence-based hunting network, economic development, the presentation of alternatives for livelihoods, the alternative for many different forms of well-being actually reduce an individual's reliance on wildlife in these specific hunting instances. Whereas in areas where we could increase enforcement, increase monitoring, and from an ethical standpoint, really crack down on hunting, it presents this case that actually increasing wealth increases their reliance on wildlife. And so it's really this cyclical dimension of people that are wealthier and wealthier relying on things that they truly shouldn't be. So if we think of this in the Madagascar setting of the kind of remote forest that I work in the Makira, and the Makira landscape is the largest remaining tract of rainforest in Madagascar. WCS co-manages this with local communities. It's around 4,000 square kilometers. It's an absolutely beautiful piece of rainforest. And what we see here is that you could think of the wildlife in the forest and with absolutely no human inputs at all. These are lemurs that are reproducing all on their own. And yet, if we think of different sorts of models looking at human impact, we could see that burning down the forest for rice agriculture or agricultural extensification will wipe out available habitat that makes lemurs thrive. Or we could think of models of even more direct human impact of hunting that, again, wipe out more lemurs and reduce this wildlife resource base that actually fosters human nutrition and human well-being in this area. Ideally, what we would want would be an intact forest, an intact ecosystem with robust populations of wildlife that could sustain local human nutrition. The problem here is that Madagascar has a faunal assemblage that can withstand almost no extrinsic mortality. And so Madagascar was only settled 2,000 years ago. All of the mammals in Madagascar were naive to predators prior to that, for the most part. And so all of this human impact is really newly developed there. And primates, bats, carnivores, they have very long lifespans, very short, very small litter sizes, long interbirth generations. And so they can really withstand almost no additional hunting. And so this really doesn't provide an example where we can use these intact forests to provide health and well-being for local communities. And so what we would need to do would be to provide certain types of alternatives that could serve the same needs. So this is a paper that we recently published. It is from around 7 years of longitudinal panel data from almost 700 households, and this is in 2 different protected areas, the Mashwala National Park, which is just east of Makira, and the Makira protected area. And what we did was we actually looked at the role of this local kind of household-to-household transaction sales for wildlife to determine the supply and demand curves for wildlife in this area. And what we found when we actually were able to value this ecosystem service value of wildlife as a provisioning service, it kind of goes back to that animation that I just showed you. With no human inputs, wildlife is actually providing humans with a food source. It turns out that this is incredibly lucrative and valuable to local people if you internalize these values. It can comprise almost 57% of their local annual cash income if we actually value their wildlife. And so that shows you this kind of conservation psychology. Their attitude, their motivation, their incentives are driving them to hunt more because this is of huge economic value to them. And yet it's unsustainable. And we also showed that higher prices of wildlife led to reduced consumption. And so the system is really in place for us to provide alternatives to this type of meat consumption that could then reduce consumption if we were able to actually increase monitoring and enforcement that would raise the prices of wildlife, or if we were able to lower the prices of alternative types of meat. We need to keep in mind also that 2/3 of all of the wildlife harvested in this region is illegal. And so whether or not it is sustainable or not, local people are actually not allowed to be doing this. The other complicated twist to this story is that we did a longitudinal health study to look at the contribution of these wild meats in their diet. And we showed that local people continued to overexploit these resources and lost access to wildlife as a food source. Their rates of anemia would increase by around 30%. So in terms of the contribution to human well-being, it's major. So we really need to take into consideration what we need to provide to local communities to support them nutritionally, to support their livelihoods, in compensation for losing access and protecting the forest. And so what we're doing is really a 3-pronged approach in Makira. We're doing a chicken intervention, we're doing mobile health clinics, and then we're also providing them health information in terms of this book that you see here. Sorry that some of this is turning out a bit light. So in terms of the alternatives and really trying to remove some of that demand for wildlife, we saw chicken as the best solution, and this was all empirically driven from research over the past 10 years. We did a taste preferences study, something that I learned from David Wilkie at WCS, and compared 23 different species of wildlife to 8 different species of domesticated meats. And across the board, chicken was their #1 taste preference, so not everything tastes like chicken. The other reasons why chicken is really good is anyone that knows anything about Madagascar knows that they have a very complex and sophisticated system of taboos called fadi. And people will have different taboos for various species of wildlife, various species of domesticated meats at various times in their life, and yet nearly across the board, nobody has a taboo for chicken. So with this very, very high reliance and need for this to be a population-level intervention and approach, chicken, again, is a good solution. From an economics point of view, chickens are more expensive than wildlife and also more preferred. So if we could develop ways of increasing their productivity and reducing their price, we actually might be able to naturally wean people away from their reliance on the forest and move them more into chickens. The mobile health clinics are there to go at more of the health outcome side of things. We'll be able to provide family planning assistance to women, nutritional consultations, prenatal visits. Less than 4% of women in this region actually go to doctors to consult for prenatal visits. These are really major health issues in this area. And so by providing them with that type of health assistance, we're really serving a tremendous need. And finally, everybody's primary form of healthcare in this region is to use traditional medicines. What I did over time was, over the past 7 years, we collected data on 250 different plant species that were being used to treat 82 different illnesses. And then I wrote this book that we just published a few months ago. It's the first book ever published and copyrighted in the Malagasy language in the US. And it is all written in the local Betsimisaraka and Tsimiheti dialect. And this is now being made available to all of the people in the villages in which we work, and all of the villages across Makira, and in all community centers and libraries across this region, to really serve as an additional health motivation for local people to work collaboratively with WCS.